visible, for it is conducted through covert means. The domestic war on terror takes place through undercover intelligence and policing that presumably preempt terrorist attacks. So it's really focused on strategies of entrapment and providing the tools, the plans, and sometimes the arms, particularly to young Muslim men, many times those who have mental health issues, and setting them up for these sting operations. This is accompanied by surveilling and infiltrating targeted communities with the help of informants from those same communities. So the politics of resistance to the secret war then also become more difficult due to suspicion and distrust that divides these communities. So it becomes impossible to mobilize if the community is so scared of who is sitting next to them in a mosque, for example. Furthermore, this internal war is also one from which the majority of citizens and residents in the US feel removed, as I mentioned, even if it is happening in their midst, in our midst, and with our implicit or explicit consent. So the war on terror is a nationalist project. It's a nation-making technology that produces youth as subjects that must be protected. So young people supposedly have to be monitored, contained, repressed, or removed if necessary through violence. So the surveillance state constitutes these racial and gendered subjects of the nation and those presumably challenging the American way of life. The war on terror also has a cultural front. It is partly a culture war in which Islam, gender, sexuality, and religion are central to debates about the meaning of national culture and Western democracy. These culture and race wars have, of course, been amplified under Trump. We've all discussed this a lot in the last several years, but they are not new. If anything, the Trump regime has permitted a discourse about white supremacy and white nationalist terrorism to finally emerge in mainstream discourse. Previously, if you used the word white supremacy, everyone thought you were a leftist loony. It just wasn't at all being discussed on CNN. Yet these white supremacist militias have until recently not been discussed through the rubric of counterterrorism and national security, though the FBI has long known of the threats such armed militias pose. In the book, I describe these culture or race wars as a form of civil war, a realization that has now emerged explicitly in US discourse since the events of January 6th. The point to keep in mind is that empire always works on two fronts, the domestic and the global. So I want to emphasize that the policing and surveillance of Muslim and Arab Americans after 9/11 is not exceptional, but part of a longer history of state regulation and repression of groups that are defined as enemy aliens or anti-American. And so I became really interested in exploring how surveillance shapes the affective or emotional and strategic responses of people targeted by the war on terror and how they live with the culture of surveillance in their daily lives. So this talk draws on an ethnographic study exploring post 9/11 activism amongst college youth in Northern California between 2007 and 2011. And it was based in Silicon Valley and Fremont and Hayward. That's why I thought that I should share this research with you. It's not too far from where many of you are probably living, where there are large concentrations of South Asian, Arab, and Afghan Americans. And so I was concerned with what it means also to produce knowledge about these communities under surveillance for myself as a researcher, and about the biopolitics of doing research when it could be seen as a form of intelligence gathering. Like, to what use would my book be put by the government? Is it providing very valuable or strategic information or data for them? So Silicon Valley was an interesting site because it has an increasingly visible and organized Muslim American community, including many Arab and South Asian immigrants, as well as Afghan refugees. In San Jose and its affluent suburbs, as well as the towns of Fremont and Hayward, which is actually home to the largest Afghan community outside Afghanistan. Yet these communities are all under-researched. So the college age youth who I interviewed for this book were generally the children of Arab, Indian, or Pakistani immigrants who had come to the US in the 60s or 70s, or of Afghan refugees from Afghanistan and Pakistan. And they were largely middle to upper middle class. They were engaged in activism both on and off campus. Some of them were at DVC, and sometimes they were involved in organized groups or movements, but others were involved in politics in informal ways. And so the question that I posed was, what does it mean to live in the everyday of surveillance? The youth I spoke to struggled with the surveillance, policing, and disciplining of their politics, particularly of political expression outside of what the state defines as moderate Muslim politics. Many grappled with the exceptional censorship and demonization of Palestine solidarity activism by the state and by right-wing groups. It's important to note that solidarity with Palestine is often presumed to be a key marker of radicalization by the counterterrorism regime, as Muslim and Arab American youth who oppose US foreign policy in the Middle East or visit radical websites that include criticism of Israel are subjected to state surveillance as automatically being supporters of terrorism. In fact, the template for the war on terror was manufactured in the 1980s to demonize those resisting US hegemony and US allies in the Middle East, and led to the, in quote unquote, suitoring of Israel and the US as defenders of Western values against Islamofascism, according to Arun Kundnani. He has a wonderful book called The Muslims Are Coming. And so this idea of Islamofascism was a term that was coined by counterterrorism experts in the 1980s as the Cold War was transitioning to the war on terror. So Muslims replaced the primal enemy of the United States and its allies, which were probably previously considered to be communists. After the fall of the Soviet Union, it was no longer the war against communists, it was the war against Muslims or Islamists. So there's a long history of surveillance of Arab and Muslim Americans involving cooperation between US and Israeli intelligence. And furthermore, Obama's counterterrorism program drew on counter-radicalization practices in Britain in a transnational circuit focused on criminalization of ideological activities. So it was not just a war on terrorism, it was a war on thought and on recruiting community leaders to police their own communities. So I'm going to talk a little bit now about what I called surveillance effects. So nearly all the young people I spoke to talked about the climate of hyper-surveillance and the chilling effect it had on dissent and understandings of what it meant to be political and also social in their everyday life, because it's also a surveillance of social networks. Arab, South Asian, and Afghan American youth have come of age in a climate in which they have to self-consciously police and self-censor their social and political lives. They were all aware that the state engages in warrantless wiretapping, monitors private emails and social media, and infiltrates mosques and activist groups with undercover informants. So it is not just those who are involved with formal political organizations who have reason to be fearful or self-conscious about the public production of their self and their identity. The social and cultural registers through which surveillance becomes a part of daily life are what I describe as surveillance effects. That is, the processes through which surveillance becomes normalized, even as it is resisted. So there's this kind of double-edged sword. It's about kind of being aware of it, but then it also becomes a kind of normalized part of everyday life. Surveillance effects shape political culture and also ideas of selfhood, producing objects of surveillance as well as of self-surveillance. So there is also an affective dimension or resonance, an emotional kind of, aspect of surveillance, feelings of fear or paranoia, anxiety or vigilance, frustration or outrage. And I argue that surveillance stories help do the regulatory work of surveillance in deepening anxieties amongst those who are the objects of surveillance based on their race, religion, nationality, citizenship status, or political activities. For example, Layla was a Pakistani American. Oh, by the way, my name assume is Layla because that's my daughter's name and I wasn't able to change it for this event. But anyway, this is a pseudonym. This was a Pakistani American student who had attended an Islamic school in Fremont, which had actually received threats after 9/11 and where the teachers were mostly Arabs and Afghans. She recalled that when students were discussing in the war in Iraq at the time, the teacher yelled at us, she said, and remarked, don't discuss it, especially in school, because it's not safe. Like they really prevented us from discussing it. I don't know if this is true, but we made jokes that it's because our mosque was taped. So this is really poignant, right? That in school, they didn't feel safe to talk about current events. These are the jokes of the 9/11 generation. An ironic discourse about surveillance that some might assume circulates only in communist countries, overseas dictatorships, and the unfree world, yet which have been very much a part of the educational, political, and coming-of-age experiences of Muslim American youth. Layla's story is actually about a moment in which the FBI had indeed targeted mosques and student groups in the US, including in California, producing a heightened awareness about political speech or indeed any kind of speech in mosque communities and amongst Muslim American youth. So in 2012, there was a stunning investigation by Associated Press of the NYPD surveillance program, revealing that they had so-called mosque crawlers and undercover informants called rakers, who were generally Muslim Arabs themselves, who had been deployed to ferret out suspicious Muslim and Arab Americans, including students and youth, And they were monitoring daily life in bookstores, bars, cafes, and nightclubs in suspect neighborhoods. And these are some of the neighborhoods, which is basically the concentrations of Muslim and Arab Americans in New York. The NYPD spying unit even mapped South Asian and Arab cricket clubs. So it was really about, trying to monitor social life and social networks. They infiltrated the Occupy Wall Street movement at the time, as some of you might remember, and Palestine solidarity rallies during the Israeli war on Gaza. So some youth at campuses surveilled by the NYPD used social media, including Twitter, to challenge this program later with some subversive humor. So the Yale Muslim Student Association, or MSA, created a Facebook page called Call the NYPD with photos of Muslim college students holding signs declaring, I'm a blonde, call the NYPD. So really trying to flip this racial, surveillance program. The revelation of this infamous demographics unit triggered some outrage in the general public and sparked the first mainstream discussion of surveillance since 9/11, which later expanded with the revelations by WikiLeaks and Edward Snowden's expose in 2013. But the responses by young people, including on social media, which is the very medium of their surveillance, right? So they're using the same technology to try to speak back to it, illustrate creative forms of countering surveillance by publicizing it on the terrain of popular culture. So the counter-radicalization regime has constructed a socio-psychological model of how youth in particular adopt extremist or jihadist politics with the help of the counterterrorism industry, which includes think tanks, experts, law enforcement, and which has been influenced by CIA practices during the Cold War. Law enforcement agencies have used deeply racialized behavioral models of radicalization that target particular youth subcultures. So markers of radicalization include, for example, urban hip hop gangster clothes, as well as traditional Islamic clothing or growing a beard, involvement in social activism and community issues. So you can be suspicious just for being engaged with your community. Of course, this ignores the radicalization of alienated white Christian youth recruited by militant white supremacist organizations. So, racialized and gendered profiling in FBI undercover operations are part of a strategy of preventative or anticipatory prosecution as the state relies on infiltration and aggressive pursuit of sting operations. These include cases involving arrests for material support of terrorism. This was a law that was passed actually under Clinton, which criminalizes charitable giving and management, free speech, free association, peacemaking, and social hospitality. So some of the largest charitable Muslim philanthropic organizations in the United States were also shut down. So people were being criminalized just for sending aid to people who were suffering overseas, oftentimes due to US policies. So I argue that these surveillance stories, such as those by Leila, help do the regulatory work of surveillance in deepening anxieties and producing self-regulation amongst those who are objects of surveillance. Was being surveilled by the FBI, and that they couldn't even go to the library to do research because of this fear, was not simply being paranoid, but expressing political subjecthood in a surveillance state. Undocumented and immigrant youth are also clearly aware that they are objects of surveillance, as are young men of color subjected to daily profiling by the police. Given that ICE is part of the Department of Homeland Security and immigration officials cooperate with law enforcement. But particularly since Snowden's leaks, which shook the US government and shocked the general public, these surveillance stories are no longer understood as being part of the lives of surveillable populations, that is Muslims, Arabs, Pakistanis, Afghans, and so on, but of all Americans. So it's an American story. So now I want to speak a little bit about countering surveillance. So various strategies of counter surveillance have been used by civil rights campaigns and young people to expose and protest state surveillance publicly as well as privately. And so one of the people I interviewed was the president at the time of the Pakistani American Center in the South Bay, which was housed in Milpitas. And he actually decided to start a community access TV show on cable TV, community cable TV, because he just felt the most public, the most sort of effective thing that he could do to counter surveillance as a Pakistani Muslim man was to be as public as possible. He said, so if one day I'm disappeared, people will know that I existed, which was very poignant, but it was also very strategic. Like he decided the best thing was not actually to hide from, this surveillance, but to kind of surveil himself and record himself and his views as publicly as possible. Another way that some respond to the perceived stigma of profiling or surveillance is to turn their experience of surveillance into a badge of honor, into an achievement. So, for example, one of the young men I interviewed was an Indian South African Muslim whose parents were very involved with the mosque in Santa Clara, the MCA, and he felt that his family was under surveillance. He suspected due to their leadership in CARE, which is a Muslim civil rights organization, which was started in the Bay Area. And I think this is strategic in some ways to kind of flip this again to say that actually it's a badge of honor. It's not a source of shame, but it's also potentially normalizes surveillance, right? Like if my family, is surveillable as leaders, it also means it's part of our everyday life and we have to live with it. One of the most bizarre cases of surveillance of Muslim American youth occurred in Silicon Valley in 2010 and involved a 20-year-old Egyptian American college student from Mission College who lived in Santa Clara, Yasser Afifi. Now, I wonder if anyone had heard of this case. It is from 10 years ago, but maybe if you can, put your hands up in the chat or something and see, I am going to show a short video clip of this, because I think it's best that you hear from Yasser Afifi in his own words about what this experience was like. So had anyone heard about this GPS tracking case? That was a GPS tracking device, by the way. Nope. Okay. So in that case, let us definitely discuss it because we really should not forget what happened to him. Afifi became the center of a storm of outrage over FBI surveillance because he took his car in for an oil change one day. And now I'm going to show you an interview with Yasser Afifi that was actually, oh, sorry, hold on one second. I think it's starting already. Let me just pause it and we will resume. Sometimes YouTube does funny things if you don't download it. So, or maybe that audio is coming from somewhere else. Is that from my computer? No, right? Okay, well then let's start over. So this is actually an interview that was done with Yasser Afifi by some students at the Islamophobia conference at UC Berkeley, which is held every other year. So I'm just going to play a few minutes of this, okay? Let's see if it's
recording. Yeah. Okay, so we're just gonna start off with some background questions. So this one is just how were you raised? Did you go to Sunday school or mosque often? Like, did you have a big presence of Islam in your life growing up?
I did have a big presence of Islam in my life growing up.
Just fast forward it a little when he talks about his case.
Can you describe the day, the events of the day, maybe, like when you first found the tracker?
Okay, well, it was a Sunday afternoon. I went to do my oil change. The regular mechanic that I always do my oil change at. And so once I left the car there, the car was lifted up. And I could see a device in the car that looked like it shouldn't be there. So I asked my mechanic if he knew what it was. And he told me no, he didn't know what it was, but it was put there recently. So I asked him to detach it, and he did. You want me to describe what it looked like, or?
Yeah, describe what it looked like.
Well, it looked like a black cylindrical device, which was battery packed. It was connected with a wire to a walkie-talkie, and that was it.
Okay, did you know what it was when you first saw it?
I had an idea of what it was, but it looked really old to be a tracking device.
Okay. And how did you feel when you found out exactly what it was? Like when you found out that it was an FBI tracker?
Confused, maybe a little bit nervous.
Okay. And do you feel that your status as an American Muslim is part of the reason why you were targeted for that device on your car?
Definitely one of the reasons.
Okay. And how did the FBI treat you when they came and interrogated you and asked for the device back? Like, did they treat you politely, or were they kind of already had a view of you as somebody who should have that treatment?
Well, there were two FBI agents,
Yeah.
a guy and a girl. The guy was really intimidating, and the lady was really charming and sweet, and she spoke fluent Arabic, so that's my second language. So I thought that was pretty cool. But they weren't really friendly. She was really charming, as I told you, but he was intimidating. He wanted the device as soon as he could get it. Threatening me with obstruction of justice, being arrested, and stuff like that.
So did they make you feel kind of like a criminal?
Oh
even
yeah,
before?
I feel like I was a terrorist.
Okay, and what kind of questions did they ask you? Do you feel that they were invasive questions, like really personal ones?
The first question I recall was, do you know why we're here? No. Where were you last Sunday? Well, I was not my mechanic. And he asked me, did you find anything there on Sunday? And I said, yes. Did you put anything there? And he goes, yeah, we put the device there. Where's the device? I told him, it's my device. Why should I be answering questions? I don't need it.
Was this your first incident with the FBI?
My first direct contact with it.
Okay. And were you like, have you been prepared on how to deal with the FBI, or was this your how to react at all?
I wouldn't say I prepared. I self-prepared myself on how to deal with the FBI.
And do you think this experience has affected your ability to trust police and local authority at all?
Well, I definitely don't trust them with my privacy.
Yeah.
I feel violated on my rights, so I don't really trust the government.
Do you think this is gonna influence like your desire to call them in an emergency? Like, would that affect?
I wouldn't ever call them unless it agency I would call would be in an emergency. That would be 911. I usually wouldn't be calling FBI.
As a student, like 10 years ago, just for Mission College, was one of the first jobs I got teaching.
In terms
We
of
went to a Jiffy Lube. When he had his car on the lift, they found that somebody, the FBI, had put a GPS tracking device on the underside of his car. And he asked, did you feel like a criminal? He's like, oh yeah, I felt like a terrorist.
They're very supportive throughout the whole thing until now they are, and but it has affected my life negatively in terms of job opportunities.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it wasn't the FBI. Your wife did it.
Have you been denied any jobs, or like twice? Oh, okay. So you've been denied a job because of this incident.
Yes.
Okay, so they brought it up with you
Verbally.
Verbally. Okay, what did they ask you?
They asked me, they asked her if you guys went to Mission College who had a tracking device on his car. I didn't lie to them. I said yes.
Okay, and they told you that they were denying you the job because of this incident specifically.
In a sweeter way, yes.
Okay. So how did you view yourself as a citizen before and after the incident?
Okay, sorry. I was just trying to actually pause it over there, but I did want you to hear the part about how it impacted his job applications when he went on the job market and how he was actually denied certain jobs because of the publicity. So as you heard, I know the quality of the video is not good because it's a student-produced video, but it's an example of people trying to use media to publicize these kinds of cases of young people who have been impacted by surveillance. This guy goes into the garage, finds that there is this GPS tracking device under his car, and that he has been surveilled by the FBI for several months for no reason. The FBI come to his house and they say, we want the device back. And in the meantime, he had posted a photo of this device on Craigslist and found out that it was actually a tracking device. So imagine if that happened to you. You suddenly go to the garage for a checkup, and you find that you have a surveillance device that the government has put under your car. So Yasser Fifi actually ended up filing a lawsuit with the help of CARE, which is the Council of American Islamic Relations, a national civil rights organization. He also tried to file a FOIA request to find out why he had been placed under surveillance, because he realized through his encounters with the FBI, they knew where he'd been to dinner, they knew where he'd been traveling, and so he had actually been monitored for several months. But they actually told him that they were not going to release his file to him, so he actually never knew why he was being placed under surveillance. All he knew was that he was Arab, that his father was actually involved with the Muslim community, and that he had traveled to Egypt. And so this incident occurred after the 9th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals had ruled that it was legal for law enforcement to place tracking devices in cars without a warrant. Now, this decision was later overturned in a case called Jones in 2012, but the Asian Law Caucus in San Francisco, which has a project called the Fred Korematsu Civil Rights Program, also had clients who reported discoveries of tracking devices under their cars, including one involving a Yemeni immigrant man in the Bay Area. And this was just as the U.S. proxy war was beginning to explode in Yemen. One of the first questions that Yasser Fifi was asked was, have you ever been to Yemen? So you can see that the U.S. foreign policy interests in overseas wars actually converge with the domestic surveillance targets at home. And so when people are being surveilled at home, we know something is going to happen or is going on overseas. So
Sunaina, could you get closer to the mic, please? Your voice is really low.
Sure. Sorry. So I recount this case of Afifi here in detail because it illustrates the intimacy of surveillance in the daily lives of Muslim and Arab American youth, and also because it demonstrates the use of technology by youth to investigate the surveillance apparatus themselves. So Afifi's encounter with the FBI also highlights the extent to which knowledge of civil rights and how to interact with intelligence and law enforcement has permeated this generation of Muslim and Arab American youth. They know what to do when an FBI agent comes to their door in many cases because they have grown up going to know your rights workshops at mosques and in their communities. So I'm just going to go back to the slideshow, and I apologize for the bad quality of that audio. I hope my audio is a little bit better now. Is that better? Yeah, thanks. Okay. So, this is actually the device that we were just talking about. We're just going to skip back to this. And this is actually an example of a comic book produced by a collective called Midnight Special that was producing these Know Your Rights pamphlets. So there's also an awareness that the surveillance states and regimes of terror are globalized, and that the US and its allies are part of a transnational apparatus of surveillance and policing that is being resisted by global solidarity movements from Santa Clara to Cairo and from Ferguson to Gaza. So Afifi later filed a freedom that I already told you about, the FOIA request. But I want to point out that there's a gendered politics at stake in post 9/11 surveillance, given the state's investment in policing and profiling Muslim and Arab males. So the focus on the racialization of young Muslim and Middle Eastern men as threats to homeland security means that their expressions of courage, anxiety, or humor are filtered through an often heightened self-consciousness about these young men, about what it means to embody the terror threat. And that's partly why I wanted to show you that clip with Yasser Afifi, talking about his own experience. Surveillance effects reveal what is at stake here, which is the livelihood and lives of young people and their families who could be in danger if they fit the profile, as well as this belief that surveillance must be resisted, including through the law. And we can talk later on, if you want, about the effectiveness of resorting to the law to challenge racist laws. But it is apparent that awareness of surveillance has shaped a political culture of student activism. For example, Aisha, who was a young Palestinian American activist who grew up in Fremont, recalled the surveillance of student labor organizing at UC Davis. She said campus police were out with cameras when we were holding rallies and sit-ins. You wondered how much of it was going to go back to the administration. We provided a space to assert ourselves politically, but it also revealed repression. Was it going back to the FBI? There were also movements at the time, such as the Stop the FBI campaign in San Jose, that were revealing and exposing the surveillance of the state. So, these are important sites of resistance. And so, we don't need to necessarily get into this theorizing, of state power, but I just wanted to point out that, in a sense, these actions reveal the extent of repressiveness of state power, which is important for resisting it. So in a sense, exposing it and knowing about it is the first step, for resistance. So this young woman, Aisha, wondered, were we getting arrested? Would it limit our prospects for getting a job? I know petitions are part of the information age, which means you put signatures and also photos on the web. We were part of the radical left, but we were also trying to be part of the system. We wanted jobs for our economic livelihood. So we had to be strategic about how to assert our political views. We started signing petitions as organizations rather than as individuals. We were worried about going to graduate school. And so I want to point this out to you. I don't know, as who many of you are students and how you feel about signing online petitions. Have you ever had to wonder about putting your name on an online petition and what the implications might be? So these concerns about financial security and career prospects are not to be taken lightly, given the profusion of blacklists of faculty and students involved in Palestine solidarity and BDS campaigns such as Canary Mission. So there's a cautiousness in this generation about the possibilities that social media offers for activism, given that it's also used for digital surveillance. So one young Palestinian American woman I met who was an activist in the Bay Area told me she had decided not to use a cell phone or Facebook for 6 months because she wanted to get off the grid as much as possible, right? And that's huge. Many Palestinian American youth worry they'll be denied entry at Israeli borders when they travel to see family in Palestine due to the networking, globally of digital surveillance. Some Muslim, South Asian, and Arab American activists began resorting to face-to-face conversations about sensitive issues, which are old school methods from the COINTEL era. So just to wrap up, they've been organized challenges, many of them even more since I did this research, embedded in the defense of progressive left movements. And locally, the Coalition for a Safe San Francisco overturned a secret agreement between the FBI and the San Francisco Police Department to work directly with the Joint Terrorism Training Task Force, or JTTF. And then very recently, last summer, in fact, the same coalition of Muslim, Arab, and civil rights activists also ended the agreement between the Oakland Police Department and the JTTF. So these campaigns are ongoing. So just to conclude, surveillance effects are complex, reshaping political subjectivity in racial, gendered, sexual, and class terms. And I argue that surveillance produces the language of democracy. Like sometimes we resort to this language of democracy when we're responding to surveillance, just as neoliberal democracy requires and produces surveillance. These experiences have propelled many youth, including those in this research, to challenge the exceptionalization of US democracy and get involved with Solidarity, Black Lives Matter, and other anti-war protests. While some youth and activists have resisted surveillance by calling for a rehabilitation of US democracy and reform of state policies, others have offered a radical critique of the imperial state, from an abolitionist lens, we would say, and built alliances between different communities under surveillance. Immigrant rights and sanctuary activists are part of the movement that has grown in the Trump era to resist federal agents, intelligence gathering, and policing. These forms of resistance help us rethink political strategies and frameworks beyond the parameters of liberal democracy and civil rights, and aim to create a progressive culture of desecuritization to defy the military spy state. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Maira. I love that all your information and research is in our local context, so it resonates immediately with most of us and most importantly, our students. So I have questions for you for sure, but I want to go to our students first. I will ask Farida and CJ to get us started. So Farida, you want to go first?
Hello. Hi, everyone. First off, thank you so much. That was such an insightful conversation. And as a Muslim American, it's very interesting to just see how everything going on currently in our community really resonates with, our actual local community, as Dr. Nyogi said. So it's interesting because sometimes I don't feel like I can really relate to a lot of my peers in that sense. So I just wanted to come on and talk about WOCA. So at the Women of Color Association, we strive to create a safe space for women of color, as well as their allies, to engage in meaningful discussions about social justice matters. We have had conversations about, actually we're having one about Black History Month, actually tomorrow. And we have a wide range of topics from code switching to menstruation and the stigmas that revolve that. So we really just try to engage and have conversations about our personal experiences. So if you're interested in joining or just stopping by for a meeting and seeing what it's about, I'll leave a link for the Zoom information and some social media info, and you can stay up to date with us that way. And tomorrow our meeting will be from 12:30 to 1:30. So we hope to see you there. And I'll pass it over to CJ.
CJ, yeah, CJ, jump in. I believe you have a question.
Yeah, hi, I'm CJ. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the president of the Women.
Again, your voice is very soft right now, CJ.
Sorry. I'm actually the president of the Women of Color Association. And again, thank you for giving this talk. It's really important. Now, being a student leader on campus, I know that you mentored many student activists from marginalized communities and movements. So I just want to know, what is a key piece of advice for students organizing at DVC or other community colleges?
Well, it's interesting because Dr. Nyogi had a very similar question, and I really appreciate it. And Selena, is that how you pronounce your name?
Yes.
It really kind of depends, Selena, I think, on the movement. It's like hard for me to give cookie cutter advice, and it would be a little irresponsible if I gave sort of blanket advice to everybody, because, every movement is different, every context is different, every campaign is different. So I think it kind of depends on what the challenges are. So can I actually ask you a question and say, what are the particular concerns you have, as a student activist or someone who is engaged in your context that you're struggling with? And then perhaps I could respond.
Yeah, so as a student leader, I find that mm, it's a little harder, especially on like with an online format. It's more difficult to engage with people because in person you would just come up to someone and hand them a flyer, and it'd be so much easier. But online, um, people can look at your website and they can choose whether or not to go, and it's just a little more like it's less personal in that sense. So um if you could like yeah, it's just a problem with connecting with the community and actually building a community online, because we're not all actually physically together.
Yeah, that's thrown such a wrench in the works. I mean, that is a whole other layer of challenges. And, to be really honest, your generation is going to be best equipped to answer that question, because this is unprecedented. That said, I mean, one of the things that I was, discussing towards the end of my talk is precisely the fact that people were getting very anxious around doing digital organizing and electronic activism because of this kind of, surveillance creep, and this realization that, digital media and social media are subjected to surveillance, and they were actually trying to resort to these old school methods, right, as I call them, of trying to meet face to face. And, when I was involved, with work in the Palestine movement during the tail end of during the second intifada, in the early 2000s, we ended up doing the same thing, because we knew that we were also possibly under surveillance. And in fact, we found out that we were, I mean, and it was pretty blatant and kind of hilarious in some ways when we thought about it. It was so overt and crass. But the point being that we were able to meet in person. And so what do you do when you can't meet in person? Of course, meeting in person is also not necessarily, a guarantee. And so I think that one of the things that really is important is awareness, right? And I don't know that awareness is necessarily built into electronic channels versus in-person channels. That's a cognitive shift, right? I mean, that's more a kind of epistemological realization. What is the enemy that we're dealing with? What are the forces that we're dealing with? That shift has to happen, and then I think the strategies or the tactics can fall, into place depending on what you think the challenges are. So what I want to point out is that, for those, not just those who are Muslim and Arab American, by identification, but for people who are involved with those movements and solidarity with those communities, they are aware that by engaging in online activism, there's this kind of double whammy of also having to worry about the surveillance, including on social media. And I will say, I mean, I'm going to just throw this out there and go out on a limb. What I hear from the student activists that I work with and undergrads in my classes who are politically engaged is many of them have a fatigue with the kind of, social media activism, with the cancel culture, with calling out. A lot of you are nodding now, so you know what I'm talking about. They also are beginning to realize that there are limits and that there are actually real dangers to that kind of click activism, right? And so those practices had all gone on before, but I think they have been amplified. So I think the question is, how can we create like an ethical framework to think about our organizing? And so I guess that, my advice to students, if I had a catch-all, which I think is not really very easy to do responsibly, would be really to be educated. I worry sometimes that with the plethora of information available, including on social media, there's actually very little education. There's like tons of information. But like I said, when I was teaching this class to my students, I mean, anyone could Google, special registration. You can Google the camp that was set up for Iranians in 1987 in Boulder. I mean, you can Google a lot of these things, but you have to know what to Google, right? So I think that to me is really important, which is why I think your program at DVC, the social justice program, and the ethnic studies classes you have, those are vital. Like, where are you going to be exposed to this information? Otherwise, you're not going to find out through Instagram, I think.
Thank you so much. That's very helpful, actually.
That's great. Great. So we want to open it up more. Are there folks, especially students in this group, who have a question for Dr. Maira? You have the chance to speak to her directly, which is why we didn't opt for a webinar format. As you can see, she is great at interacting. So please go ahead. Anyone have a question?
There's actually a question in the chat, which is quite interesting by Kat. Do you think I should respond to that?
Yes, please go for it.
Yeah. So I don't know if they want to read it themselves, but I've heard a lot of talk about discouraging government surveillance and infiltration of white supremacist terror groups because any efforts and laws towards that end will just be used to get immigrant Americans and Muslim American communities. Do you agree, or is this just another form of white exception to government rules and practices? I'm wondering if Kat, you could clarify a little bit. So what do you mean talk about discouraging? Do you mean challenging government surveillance and infiltration of terror groups? Because if we challenge that surveillance, it will still be used against immigrant and Muslim Americans, or?
So basically what I've been reading and hearing about is just any new laws or things that are pushed to surveil those groups will just be turned back on groups that have always been surveilled. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, that's a very important question. Thank you, Kat, for raising that. I was hoping that, towards the end, we could get in that kind of debate about countering surveillance. So yeah, so I guess I think what you're asking is, so if we just ramp up surveillance and more kind of profiling and infiltration of these white supremacist terror groups and create more laws, in fact, to prosecute them, including as domestic terrorists, as now they're being called, including by Joe Biden after January 6th, then the danger of that is that we just kind of, intensify the apparatus of counterterrorism that in essence is always a racialized apparatus, and that will double down on the pre-existing ongoing racialization and criminalization and policing and surveillance of Black and Brown communities. So I'm glad you raised this because I myself was grappling with this debate. And, I also experienced some tension around this for a minute because, my response too, when I saw the armed mob invading the Capitol was like, well, these are terrorists. Why doesn't anyone call them terrorists? And then, Chuck Schumer called them terrorists, and then Biden called them terrorists, and CNN was calling them terrorists. And then I began also to hear some pushback to this idea that we should just, keep expanding the definition of terrorism. So we have equal opportunity terrorism that now also includes white terrorists. Because in a sense, what we want to do is we want to abolish that state apparatus that rests on power and coercion and violence, right? So expanding it is actually not helpful. It's not helpful because it is already a racialized apparatus, and it will probably create just more blowback against the most vulnerable populations, not those who are aligned with state power, but it also means that we are resorting to a state-centric definition, right? Terrorism is a state-centric term. It's a paradigm that is used to divide state violence from non-state violence. So expanding it further only reinforces the power of the state to clamp down with violence. So I do agree with you. That's a very thoughtful question. And then there's some others. And so people don't hear just me talking to someone else. Want to read one of the questions? Maybe Albert or something.
I see my comrade Mickey Huff dropping it there. So Mickey, you wanna just
unmute and say it?
Yeah, just go for it, Mickey.
Oh, hi folks. Fantastic presentation. Thanks to Matthew Powell for reminding me to jump out of a meeting and get in here. I've taught a course about a lot of these issues for almost 20 years now, at DVC in particular. So I'm delighted that you're here today to present this information. As I was writing in the chat, the ghosts of COINTELPRO are alive and well. And historically, they have not been used against the right. The FBI's own data shows that they know where violent extremism comes from, and they turn a blind eye. One of the stories I was just going to post about this was the story about the FBI and what they called Black identity extremists. right? Those were actual terms that they're using. I missed the very beginning of the presentation, so I don't want to take much of your time, but I can't stress enough how important and significant this topic is. And I am just delighted to see that you're all talking about it. And I think more of us need to talk about it. I posted a couple links from EPIC and Electronic Frontier Foundation out of San Francisco. EFF is, they've got some great resources that students might use to try to be safer online. But there really aren't a lot of perfect fixes for this. And I caution people who are calling for more surveillance and more infiltration after the January 6th event at the Capitol, because historically, as Chris Hedges and others have astutely pointed out, these powers are used against the people. They're used against people's movements. They're used against the left, progressives and immigrants. And so to see people on the progressive left cheerleading this kind of state power abuse is quite alarming to me. And I think that we should be careful about what some people seem to be wishing for.
That's great. Thank you. And for some reason, I thought of Project Censored. So
well, that's me.
I know. That's right. I was like, wait, isn't that you?
How are you?
Nice to see you again. I listen to your show a lot. It's so important, and that's part of the culture of counter surveillance. And I agree with you. I mean, I think some of the debates that, in the context of, organizing in defense of Muslim and Arab American communities that we engaged in with the Electronic Frontier Foundation at the time, I remember meeting in their office in person to talk about this, is that how can we, produce a response that is not defensive, but that advances movement organizing while we are trying to respond? Because, we obviously always are supposed to be on the defensive and diverting our energies, just to reacting to one onslaught after the other. And the technology, it's endless. And so this is why when people from the communities that are under hyper-surveillance ask me this, I always think it's best, obviously, to proceed from the assumption that you are under permanent surveillance, to be very aware of it, to actually, perhaps normalize it in your existence, and then move forward with that knowledge and act appropriately. There's no point denying it, and there's no point being excessively fearful around it. And so I do feel like making the links between different movements is very important. So when the FBI started using that term last year, Black identity extremist, it's really important to make the linkages and look at the intersections between the long history of that term, which goes back to COINTELPRO, but even before, and the current policing. My concern in kind of returning to this book that I thought I was kind of done with a while ago is that I think that the discussion of certain movements tends to drop out of that debate, including sometimes, if I may say this, amongst progressives and liberals, right? And so we need to have a really expansive and inclusive framework, because, it is true, the policing and surveillance operate slightly different in targeting different movements, right? And different registers are used, but it's so easy to divide the left and divide movements if we don't look at how these are connected,
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Because I want to hold, I'm eager to ask a question, but I want to hold back.
You are allowed to ask a question, Albert.
No, I'll open it up. I just wanted to ask, well, one thing. You mentioned Canary Mission in passing, but can you expand upon Canary Mission for those who are not familiar?
Yeah, so Canary Mission, unfortunately, is a very prevalent anonymous website. I mean, the source has actually since been revealed through some investigative journalism of Canary Mission, but it is in brief an anonymous blacklisting website that would list, kind of arbitrary lists of names of people, faculty, students, and activists who are involved in criticizing the Israeli state. And it would actually, threaten to send this information to prospective employers, to prospective graduate school departments in order to threaten and intimidate activists. It appeared about 4 years ago. And since then, hundreds of people I know personally are on this list, but it has been most frightening and frustrating and painful for undergraduate students. And it has precisely emerged at the time that the campus movement for justice in Palestine was expanding across the United States. And so given that this movement is legally protected by the First Amendment, one of the things that the forces opposed to justice in Palestine resorted to was, like states, I suppose, undercover, secretive, and anonymous forms of targeting that are based on intimidation and harassment and smearing. And it has created a great deal of anxiety because when people's names get on these black lists, like, I mean, I'm on it, and I keep hoping I'm still on it because, I should be. If I'm speaking out and doing anything worthwhile, then people should take a note of it. But it's very anxiety provoking for undergraduate and graduate students, for junior faculty, for people who are unemployed or underemployed to have their names on the website because, any employer can Google it. And, the propaganda they have on the site is so racist, but it's also very misleading. And so these are the new kinds of forces that one is dealing with, which are forms of kind of digital surveillance, right? And digital cancel culture in a sense. So yeah, thank you, Mickey. Uh-huh.
So
Can you hear me?
I have a question. Oh, sorry about that.
No, go for it. Sorry, excuse me.
Oh, thank you. So I just out of curiosity. So after the 9/11 attacks, they increased surveillance on specific people of certain beliefs, such as Muslims and people who side with the Palestinian conflict and whatnot. So my question is, was there also an increased quote unquote threat after that, or did they just push that through because of 9/11 and just continuously use that as a reason to spy on the citizens?
Continued threat, I'm assuming, of terrorists or threats against the United States,
Yes,
right?
correct. Yes.
Right. That's an absolutely excellent question that goes to the crux of the matter, which is that, interestingly, when they rounded up, about 20,000 Muslim men in this mass federal registration program called special registration, like everything's very special when it comes to Muslim Americans, they rounded them up to gather intelligence on these non-citizens of Muslim background from 24 different Muslim countries. They found zero connections to terrorism. The counterterrorism regime was able to uncover zero terrorist plots in those first couple of years. So what they started to do was manufacture terrorist plots. So most of the plots that have been prosecuted of, terrorism against the United States were plots in which the FBI was involved. They recruited people, they targeted them, they provoked them, incited them, provided them with plans, weapons, and operations. And so this threat has to constantly be kept alive in order to justify the use of surveillance and policing, right? If there's no threat, there's no need for this, big department. There's no need for all of these wars that are all in the name of counterterrorism. So I guess that, the deeper question behind that, Felix, is, there's constantly a war at home. There's constantly a war overseas. The US is constantly at permanent war. Why, right? Why is all this money spent on war? We have a broken healthcare system. Millions of people are sick, hundreds and thousands of people are dying because we don't have healthcare in this developed country. We have a broken educational system. We have a broken childcare system, and we have a broken social welfare system. So you think about that, put the two together. That's why it happens,
So I have actually a follow-up question to that. So as people, sorry, I'm losing my train of thought there. But basically, if there's no correlation, if they haven't found any correlation to that, even though they've been spying on so many people, so why do they keep trying to entrap this? I mean, what do they gain out of surveilling people who don't pose a threat? What do they do with this information?
That's what I was trying to hint at. I was trying to say that there is a need for a military spy industrial complex in this country that could actually justify its bloated budget at the expense of programs that help the people. In order to justify it, you need to constantly keep the threat alive. There constantly need to be scares. So therefore, it's a long discussion we could have, but the point is that this is justified by constantly keeping the public anxious about this as a possible threat to their survival. Now, it turns out that the threat to survival all along was these white supremacist militias up and down the Northwest that they actually were aware of for decades, but that they did not bother to create public scares about inclusion with the media. I think there was actually another person who had been waiting to ask a question. Did we miss them?
Was it Chris?
Chris, you go ahead, jump in.
Thank you so much. So Doctor, question about your work in Palestine. Really, I know the Palestine strife is really hard for the people there, and I know when I say I'm pro-Palestine, that means I'm anti-Israel. So that can mean I'm anti-Semitic. Same with the recent acts of violence against the Asian community here on the elderly people here in the Bay Area that was introduced in the speaker notes in the beginning. Unfortunately, a lot of them have been caused by African American communities. So a lot of people tie that with, I'm for protecting these elderly Asian people, like, oh, you must be anti-Black because a lot of people are doing this. So how do I make that dissociation where if I'm pro something, it doesn't mean I'm anti against that other group, where if I'm pro Palestine, it doesn't mean I'm anti-Israel, meaning I'm not anti-Semitic. I mean, I just have that hard dissociation where I need to cut that line between people because they like to group me or anyone in general. I'm just using myself as an example of just taking that extreme counter argument.
Yeah, thank you, Chris. That's such an important question. I appreciate you giving me an opportunity to clarify this because, I mean, this has been going on for years, you know, and it's so frustrating. So there are 2 points. One, I think the way to kind of cut through this mess is to take a principle-based approach as opposed to an identity or group-based approach or even a national approach. So what I mean by that is I prefer, rather than saying pro-Palestine and anti-Israel, which makes it sound like a soccer match, like you're one team or you're another team, I prefer saying you're pro-racial justice, or perhaps you're anti-war or you're anti-occupation, and then to proceed from there, because there are Israelis and there are Jewish people who are also pro-racial justice. The point is, of course, that, you know, being critical of a state should not make one racist. We're critical of the Chinese state. We're critical of the Russian state. We don't automatically assume in this country that people are anti-Chinese just because they, you know, challenge human rights violations or, you know, repression of democracy in China. Why do we do that in the case of Israel? We do that in the case of Israel because the powerful forces that are aligned behind that dominant narrative and behind that exceptional alliance have no political arguments, because on the face of it, the human rights violations are so egregious, right? This is the longest military occupation in modern history in defiance of human rights law. Therefore, the resort to the allegation of automatic anti-Semitism for criticizing government's abuses is a silencing tool, right? I mean, so we cannot make an equation between a state and entire community. In fact, to do so could be anti-Semitic, because if you assume that all Jewish people, you know, every single one of them has automatic inherent genetic allegiance to the state of Israel, that's actually kind of a racist assumption, right? So that's one counter argument. But I think the kind of more profound counter argument is really to say that you are pro-racial justice in Israel-Palestine, you are pro-peace, you are pro-freedom, right? Rather than getting into pro-Palestine and anti-Israel. And then I think that definition of anti-Semitism, which is used as a silencing tool, is simply to censor people, right? And if you want to go to the Jewish Voice for Peace website, they have an excellent statement about anti-Semitism from a progressive left Jewish perspective that will kind of demolish that argument for you, which was used by the Trump administration, by the way. You know, they try to legalize it.
Right. Thank you so much, Doctor. Really appreciate all that information.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So Dr. Maira, thank you for being generous with your time. Do we have any more questions from our audience? Erica, do you want to ask your question? Oh, research. She wants to know about research, which is great because that was my question too. I mean, we live in this context, so it's really interesting. And you're pointing out that the second generation is politicized, right? And a lot of our students probably, again, identify with that. I was just immediately wondering about the parents, the previous generation, what their reaction is. Because as a parent myself, I'm scared for my kid, right? And so how do the parents deal with the surveillance and the risks involved and all of that? And then just thinking about your research, there's so much of the collaborative work that you do, and you get your students to do the research with you. So all that is fascinating, and it would be great if you could speak a little bit more about that.
So I think actually Erica's question was a little bit different. It was on the Muslim and Arab grocery stores and COVID. So which one did you want me to respond to in the time we have?
Yeah, you could respond to that's your more recent work, right? And then just the methodology is interesting as well.
Yeah, so to talk about the focus on Arab and Muslim small businesses during COVID, maybe for a minute, I actually had initially wanted to do a larger project looking at the impact of Trump's immigration policies on Arab refugees, on the intersections of the sanctuary movement with Arab and Muslim communities who are also seeking sanctuary or asylum officially or unofficially, during the whole kind of debate as well as organizing on campuses around sanctuary. Again, I was a little concerned that, somehow that story was missing, from the puzzle. But then, as when the pandemic happened, I just actually couldn't go out into the community very easily to do field work. And so I pivoted and decided to combine my grocery shopping in the essential businesses that were open with doing, my community-based ethnography. And so I decided to focus on, Arab grocery stores that were open during COVID and were on the front lines of the pandemic. And it turns out in Oakland, and also in the Bay Area, a large majority of these are owned by Yemenis who, families back home are suffering from the world's worst humanitarian crisis. Like folks, I hate to say this, but if you don't mind, I mean, it's like, we go a few days without electricity and, everyone is understandably frustrated. But, in a country like Yemen, where there's mass starvation, death due to cholera, no electricity, no clean water, and then, drone warfare, violence, closures of ports and airports, people are trapped in this living hell. And their communities here are the ones who are serving many of these neighborhoods through these corner stores. So I have basically been trying to understand what the experiences have been like of these small business owners, and how, these family businesses, which often include young people and kids also working in the stores, have been experiencing the pandemic here and then the crisis back home in this kind of transnational context. So in fact, if you're interested, I think I'll try and do a screen share one last time. I'm organizing a town hall this Sunday at 4 o'clock. If any of you want to join on Zoom, you can email me for the link, or you can email my research assistant, whose email address is at the bottom, elazuz@mail.sfsu.edu. But we also really wanted to organize this in order to honor these essential workers, who have been keeping their grocery stores open during this crisis, and who are also immigrants themselves from war zones. So looking at the impact of the Muslim ban as well as of the COVID pandemic on their experiences. So. Did you want me to address your question as well, Sangha? Or
If you could, I know we are running out of time, so yeah, if you could address that. And also, since we are setting up our ethnic studies program, any words of advice for that? Because that's happening right now. We're deeply immersed in it. And I know you come from the Asian American studies and you use multiple methodologies. Your work is all interdisciplinary. So any words of advice there would be helpful.
So sorry, what was it again? So the ethnic studies, and then what was the first question?
The first one was about the methodology you use with, working with students.
Right, yeah.
Research.
Yeah, I do talk about it more in the book. So maybe in the interest of time, I would encourage people to read the introduction where I talk about my methodology. But in general, in all of my projects, I try to use, what's now called community engaged research. But in ethnic studies, we've been doing this for a long time before it was called engaged research, which is to really, my research emerges from my involvement with the communities that I'm organizing with. And I also, through my research, then sometimes bring back, perspectives, to the movements that I'm involved with. And so for me, it's always been very intertwined. And, I actually really have appreciated the input of my students, particularly for this project, the 9/11 generation, because it was about college students. And so the students were actually essential co-researchers because they were the ones who were involved with these networks. I mean, they understood like which coffee shop to go to, what questions to ask. And so, that was actually something that was like so incredibly fruitful and generative for me to be able to talk through these things for them. They also were my community. I mean, I'm the only person in my department who focuses on South Asian and Muslim Americans, and I'm actually the only person on campus at UC Davis. I have colleagues who do South Asian studies or Islamic studies. So they were really my interlocutors. And then in terms of ethnic studies, Sangha, I really do feel like, again, it's hard to give a cookie cutter response because every institutional context is different and every local context is different. But I'm deeply aware that there is a huge battle raging over institutionalizing ethnic studies still in 2021. And that disturbs me. Like, we shouldn't have to make these arguments in 2021. Why was the ethnic studies model curriculum that was approved by the committee, actually vetoed, right? And a watered down version passed by the governor for K through 12. Like, I mean, this shouldn't be happening, so many years. So it shows that, the battle is still important, right? And I know that it takes a lot of energy. So kudos to all of you for doing the work you're doing. Your students are so fortunate, and I'm sure they're fighting this too.
Thank you so much. This was a great presentation.
Or do you want to close us off?
No, I just want to, everybody unmute and let's do the official clap, not the we'll try to make it as real as possible. No, and I want to thank you, Dr. Maira. This was an amazing talk, and took me back to my days, on the ground and coming of age and really challenging the Homeland Security state. So this was really good. I think this, and I just want to remind everybody, I dropped the survey in the chat, and also to join us for our next social justice speakers series where we ask the question, what is ethnic studies, right? So I invite everybody to do that, to join us in on March 11th. And thank you, Dr. Maira. Thank you, everybody, for coming in.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Wonderful discussion. Thank you. Take care. All the best.
Appreciate you joining us. Sangha, do you have a minute, Sangha?
Yes, I can stay on.
Yeah, can you stop the recording? Do you have that?
Yes.
We're talking about